So we're going to take a look at Agile and Waterfall. A couple of definitely, almost arguably, these are the most popular software development lifecycle methodologies. Waterfall, been around for a very long time. Agile, maybe a little younger version, but definitely a very popular one. And so we're gonna cover this by first looking at Agile. We're gonna talk about that a little bit and get into a couple specifics about the Agile approach, not too deep. We're going to talk about Waterfall and what it is and what it contains. And again, not too deep into it, but just to give ourselves essentially sort of a refresher course in that. And then we're going to compare and contrast the two. And then actually what I'm going to do is wrap up by taking a simple example. We're going to have an application and we're going to talk about going through in a Waterfall approach and an Agile approach. And it's contrived. So there's going to be some things that occur as this process goes on that sort of help highlight maybe some of the strengths and weaknesses of the two different approaches. So just in general, software development lifecycle, just to make sure we're on the same page with this. And it's commonly referred to as the SDLC, and you'll see it referred to as SDLC throughout the rest of this presentation. And what it does, it describes how to take a software product or a project from an idea to the actual solution. So through implementation and deployment, maintenance, and beyond. The easiest way to think about it, I feel, is that software development lifecycle is an attempt to provide a sort of an assembly line approach to creating software, much as you would a physical product, where you would have maybe like think about a car being built, where first it's the maybe the frame, and then they move along and maybe they slap some tires on it, and then put a body on it, and then put paint on that. We want to do software in a somewhat similar way, where it's a very repeatable process as we go from product to product. And it covers the things that we do with every piece of software. It's not necessarily specific to any one solution. Continuing with definitions, just again to make sure we're on the same page. Agile is an SDLC approach. We're going to talk a little bit more about it, but it's characterized by its desire to focus over what they essentially refer to as actual work as opposed to administrative tasks. It's defined, actually Agile itself, there's the agilemanifesto.org where you can actually see where it's defined. That has been altered over the years to mean a lot of different things to different people. But if you want to see the source of it, and we'll actually talk about that a little bit here in a minute, that you can always go to that site. But really what Agile does is says, look, we can do or we can document. And we prefer doing over documenting. And not saying that you don't ever document, but you're better off to do than document. In general, just again, from a definition point of view, methodology is just an approach to performing a task. In the SDLC world, a methodology describes how do you complete the steps defined by SDLC. Waterfall, it is the earliest SDLC model approach that was used. And it is a linear approach. You walk through each step, you're going to make sure you get it done, and then you move on to the next step. And again, we'll dig into this a little bit more shortly. So let's start with Agile. Besides being a buzzword and a very popular approach, there are definitely some important concepts and methods and thoughts of how software should be built or is built that Agile embraces. Now, from the Agile Manifesto, from that site, basically I think this is probably one of the key parts, and I'll just go with the quote. We're uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. That is, while there is value in the items on the right side of this, we value the items on the left more. So everything where it says, individuals and interactions on the left side over processes and tools on the right side. So it doesn't mean that there is, and this is very key because some people use Agile to say, oh, well, we don't have to document stuff. Like, no, that's not what it says. It just says that we would rather have working software over comprehensive documentation. It doesn't mean we don't want comprehensive documentation. It just means that if we had to choose between the two, choose working software. And that's very critical to remember as we go out into the real world and hear how Agile is used and abused. This slide actually, I've got a more of a. This is actually getting into the Agile Manifesto, so it's just really so you've got a copy of it. I'm not going to read through it here, but there are, as you can see from the little bullet points on the left, there's a lot of little things that make up an Agile approach. Now, this is definitely a philosophical kind of manifesto. There are concrete implementations of it that Scrum and Kanban and stuff like that have been have gone from this and said, okay, this is a great idea. How do we actually make this work? How do we make this real? And that's what some of the different Agile approaches are. And I'm not going to go into all of those because that's a discussion in itself. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of thought that's gone into the Agile Manifesto and what their focus is. A key piece, and we're going to see this as we go into our example of a Agile project, or at least that methodology, using the Agile methodology with a project, is a sprint. And what a sprint is it is our little, basically we're going to take, what the project would be, and we're going to break it into all these little, essentially mini projects. Each mini project being a sprint, with being a period of time that we are going to work on some tasks and complete them and then move on to the next one. Any given sprint is going to include really all of the pieces of the software development lifecycle. So we're going to talk about in a sprint, we're going to have some planning and grooming, which is basically what are we going to do and what can we get done in the time period that we've laid out for this sprint. And we're going to get a requirements analysis. So then we're going to start from there and say, okay, if we're going to do this stuff, this is what we're going to do. Well, let's make sure that we have all the requirements that we need, that we understand what it is we're going to build. And then we, from there, move into design. We're going to design what it is we're going to build, and we're going to walk through what we're going to implement. And then you get into an implementation piece where you're writing the code. There's going to be unit tests that's built for that. You're going to apply your unit test to your code to make sure it works. And then you move into a system or acceptance testing kind of piece where you get the QA team in, you get somebody that didn't write the code to go test it. And also this is where we start plugging all of our units together and make sure that integration works. And then in a lot of cases, ideally a sprint ends with some sort of a deployment or delivery or a build or something like that would allow you to actually, for lack of a better term, play around with what was built during that sprint. Now, one of the big things that you get out of Agile is, and it's sort of it's really an unspoken focus, basically, is the 80-20 rule. It's the Pareto principle, but also known by more commonly as the 80-20 rule, which says that 80% of your effort goes into 20% of the solution, and correspondingly 20% of your effort goes into 80% of the solution. So what you get out of these sprints are, instead of trying to solve the whole thing and really master it, we accept the fact that there's going to be some changes and there may be some things that we don't exactly know. So rather than try to get it 100% right, we're going to get mostly there, or as close as we can get, and make the best use of our time. If there's some refining or additional details that we need to deal with, we can always catch those in another sprint. We're going to get as far as we can with what we know and then move on, instead of trying to essentially backlogging everything and saying, okay, well, let's wait and not really get into this until we know everything we think we need to know to get it done. And in doing so, this leaves room for change. It allows you to, look at something this sprint and say, this is how I want it to do work. This is how we see it, becoming real. And if it changes a week from now or 2 weeks from now, that's okay. We'll adapt at that point. We can refine our solution in later sprints. We could even refactor. We could even go back and say, oh, you know what? We didn't get this quite right. It turns out that we have we've got to change the requirements, and now we got to change it around. But the important part of all of this is it allows us to progress forward on a project while some of these bigger problems are getting fully resolved. For example, you may have, let's say you have a registration screen in an application. You could have a sprint where you build out that registration screen, but you're not really nailing it down and saying, all right, I want to make sure I know every value that's going to be on that screen. I'm going to go in, I'm going to create it based on what we know for now. And then if it comes in later that they say, oh, by the way, we didn't mention this before, but we need to make sure we capture the, let's say, the user's their home address. We didn't have that before, but initially we had a registration that was first name, last name, phone number, email address. They come back later and say, oh, by the way, we need their actual home address as well. Okay, well, we'll put that into a later sprint and we'll add that in and adjust accordingly. Now, there can be some issues with this, and we'll talk about that a little later, but it definitely sprint is going to give you, and Agile, much like its name implies, is going to keep you a little more flexible in building your software out. So let's switch gears and look at Waterfall. The Waterfall methodology, like I said, has been around for a long time. It is all inclusive, and it covers the things that you need to do to create software. The methodology focuses on getting one step done before you move to the next, but it does cover all the steps. This one is also sometimes referred to as the linear sequential lifecycle model because it has for all the things we have to do to build software, it has an order. It says this is the order they should be done. And I think it'd be pretty hard to argue that is not a valid order. It'd be very hard to implement before you have requirements. Designing after you implement doesn't make sense, things like that. So it's really hard to argue against the waterfall model in itself, the way it approaches things. The argument, I guess, would be is that one of the key things, and this is sort of down in the last little bit of this slide, is that every phase completes before it moves on to the next phase. That's part of waterfall. It's a very clean, like a stair-step approach that you completely finish one step and then you move into the next one. You don't have an overlap in the phases. And that has its strengths and its weaknesses as well. And of course, as part of completing each step before you move on to the next one, there's some deliverables or artifacts or documents that are going to be the demarcation of completing that step, because that documentation really feeds the next one. So when you start out, you gather your requirements, and there's going to be a requirements document you're going to put together. And then you design, and then based on those requirements, and then that's going to be a design document that's put together. And then you implement using that design document, and that's going to result in essentially a deployment or an application or something. And that application is going to be what gets tested as part of integration and going through that quality assurance process. And there's going to be a little bit of a cycle there to some extent, because they're going to test, there's going to be some fixes, and then the output of the testing process is an application that's been tested. It may not be bug free, but is stamped valid for deployment, and then you deploy it out, and then from there then you basically repeat, but it's essentially go into maintenance, and each maintenance can be another waterfall approach. And just to sort of reiterate how those steps go, each step is completed. And like I said, there is some sort of deliverable. There is something that you can look at and say, did this complete? Yes, it did, because I have the artifacts, the documentation that I expected for this step. Now, within Waterfall, what it does allow you to do is that means each step most likely is going to have, to some extent, a specialized team that focuses on that task or the tasks for that step. So in the requirements phase, you're going to have people that's what they do. Your team is going to be the people that are best suited to gather and document your requirements. When you move into the design phase, the people working on the project are the designers. When you get in the implementation phase, the people working on it are those that are best at implementing. Now, that doesn't mean that you never speak again to the people that do requirements or the people that do design, but ideally, if it was done right, they really don't have to. They could fall off the face of the earth and it wouldn't matter, because they put together the documents at the end of their step that handed it over to the next one. And so they probably theoretically, they should never be needed again for that project. I'm not saying just fire them or whatever, but it is one of those where they could move on to another project. They don't really care that the implementation team spends the next 3 years implementing it. Those people can go off and do other things. And then, of course, once implementation is done, it moves into QA. QA, obviously, you're going to need the implementation team around to do, they're going to have to do fixes and things like that. But even there, technically, I guess you could move on and have fixers or something like that. So you could have a different specialization that's used for those. Obviously, the testers are, specialists in themselves. So for the testing phase, you're going to have dedicated, specialized professional testers. And then, probably even when you get to deployment, you're going to have a deployment team that knows how to take software and deploy it. In general, as we talk into the comparison and contrast, Waterfall works better for smaller kinds of projects, things that are shorter periods of time and stable. If you change requirements a lot, then obviously you're going to have issues. If you've got this documentation and it's been, you've gone through requirements, you've gone through design, you get an implementation, and everything is it goes back and it's based on those requirements. If they change, well, then technically you would need to go back and restart the requirements phase and design and everything else. There's better ways to do that. You're not going to start from scratch, but technically that would be, I guess, how it would work. And again, just to reiterate, each step as you complete, it is the source information for the next step. So you are fed by the prior step, and then you feed the next step as in the waterfall approach. So think about comparing and contrasting these two different approaches. Agile is a progressive approach to software. You have these sprints, and so each one you're making progress on your solution, on your application, and you sort of build, well, not sort of, you build from process to sprint as a process evolves. You've got things that you built in the prior sprint and you're building on top of it or extending it or maybe even refining it. So you see this application, just ideally each sprint there is, as I mentioned, a release. So you would have, even after that first sprint, you'd have something, you'd have some sort of application. And then in the next sprint, you'd have that same application, but now it has more functionality, or it looks better, or it's more fleshed out, depending on how you look at it. Waterfall approach is an all at once. Technically, you don't get anything until you are done with that, that given step. So with waterfall approach, I go through requirements and I get a requirements document that I pass on. I go to design and I get those documents and I pass those on. I go to implementation and I build everything. And that at the end of implementation would be technically the first time anybody would ever see the application. Now, maybe during implementation, people are seeing pieces of it in that, but the first time you would ever see anything close to the end application is at the end of implementation. So it's an all at once thing. You have nothing, and then you have everything. And think about that at each step of the way. You don't have anything until you get to the end and you deliver those documents. There is nothing within the waterfall approach that allows you to, we'll say, peek into progress on a given step. Now, I mean, there's ways to do it, but definitely by methodology, it doesn't address that. Now, in that same vein, and we've already talked about this a little bit, Agile is going to be a flexible approach because you're making these, you're doing these smaller approaches to getting to the end. Then at each point, each of those little small things allows you to adjust. Each sprint allows you to, you complete, and then you can make adjustments as you go into the next sprint. While you may plan out 50 sprints ahead, at any given time, you can say, oh, wait, things have changed. And so you can start, adjusting your schedule. You can plan differently. Waterfall is more rigid, far more rigid, because you don't get those adjustment points. Technically, you could adjust at each step. So you can go through requirements and complete that. And what you thought you were going to design is slightly different. But technically, you didn't even think about what you were going to design because you didn't start the design step until requirements is done. And so that becomes really the only, those are the only points, if at all, that you would be able to make adjustments. So maybe at the end of design phase, you have some additional requirements, and you say, okay, we're not going to run through requirements and design again, but we are going to do a brief, we're going to put together an addendum which is basically says, hey, here's an additional requirement, here's a little bit of design work we did, and then we can move into implementation. Theoretically, then there's no other changes to anything until you're done with implementation. And the next time you'd be able to make any adjustments would be in the testing phase. That's pretty rigid. Also, when you think about it, Agile is actually sort of complicated because you've got all of these little steps and you've got things going on essentially at the same time. You have multiple things going on at the same time. So it does become more complicated. Waterfall is actually a pretty straightforward and direct way to do stuff. It's very focused. You get your requirements, do your design, do your implementation, test it, deploy it, boom, done. Agile basically has you doing all of those things and doing them over and over again and constantly looking at how to build in the next sprint on what you've done in this sprint or in the prior sprints. And you may think that, okay, Agile sounds pretty cool and there's all these things that, quote, simplify software development, but really executing it properly is probably a more complicated and definitely a process that requires a more of an attention to project management and product management. And we see that now where Scrum Masters and other Agile roles and professions are becoming more and more a requirement for teams because they realize they've got to have that kind of manager. They've got to have that kind of coordination to be able to get things done and not have things fall between the cracks. Agile, as we talked about in the manifesto, it's focused on the outcome. Really, the key to Agile at the end of every sprint is, do we have the next step towards the product or the solution that we wanted to have? That's what we want, because that is the deliverable. When you get to the end of the sprint, the deliverable is that deployment. That's the focus. Waterfall, it's the deliverables for each step. It's the documentation. It's the artifacts. When I get done with requirements phase, what do I have? I better have a requirements document, and it better be a solid one. When I get done with the design phase, what should I have? I better have a design document, and so on and so forth. Even at the end of testing phase, I should have, here's the scripts that I've executed, and here's what failed, and here's what's passed. And maybe you have some history on that, well, this failed, and then we eventually fixed it. But at the release level, this is what we tested, this is what passed. So when we go into that deployment, we have that documentation. Now, granted, we have the application as well, and we have the artifacts from the prior steps. So we would still have the design document and the requirements document. But the key is, what does that step produce? I think the complexity in that that, as I mentioned, there are these new roles and new jobs that come out of stuff that really means Agile requires really sort of a broader skill set. Waterfall, because you're so focused in each step, allows you to have these specialists. So you can have a requirement specialist, a design specialist, a coder, an implementation specialist, a QA specialist, a deployment specialist. But since all these people are working together in a sprint in the Agile approach, there becomes a little more of a blurring of where one role ends and another one begins. That doesn't mean that you can't have some very tightly defined responsibilities for your various team members within an Agile approach. But what you're going to end up having is you're going to have people that are going to be more exposed to some of the other areas of software development. And so that blurring lines and that there's going to be a little bit of almost like cross training in that is going to, it's going to be helpful if your team has a broader set of skills. And over time, it's going to develop a team that has a broader set of skills. So in an Agile approach, if you've got a bunch of people, let's say you've got some coders that's all they've ever done is code, they're probably going to struggle quite a bit compared to people that have coded but also spent some time designing and testing and things like that. Because you don't have, in a sprint, you're going to be more responsible for, as an implementer, let's say, gathering, understanding the requirements and doing some design and, and doing back and forth with the testers and things like that. You're going to be sucked into all these different places. And if you don't have any experience in them, you're going to struggle. If you've got a broader skill set, you're going to be much more effective in an Agile environment. And although there's a lot of there are a lot of pluses to an Agile environment and the approach, this is something that sometimes, some teams, this is why part of the reason they just don't do Agile well is that they don't have a team that really has that broad knowledge and experience to lean on and allow them to really work within this slightly less defined, less rigid environment. In general, Agile, when you're building a solution, Agile is a more open approach to getting to a solution, because it starts by saying we really don't know what we're going to build exactly, and maybe just vaguely. Because what Agile does is it says, okay, we're going to start implementing, we're going to start working on stuff, and as we move into this project, we're going to continue to refine where it is we want to go. If it was a car ride, Agile is you jump in the car and you start driving in a direction. And maybe you don't have a map and you're just trying to get to the other side of the country. And initially, maybe you're like, I don't even know what city I want to end up on the other side of the country. I just know I want to go to the other side of the country. So I start, let's say you start on the East Coast, you're moving to the West Coast, you start heading west. Doesn't really matter how you get there. And maybe along the way, you're like, hey, I want to go take a side trip and go see this site, or I want to go over and check out this restaurant or whatever it is. So you're not going to get that straight line. Waterfall is a very defined, we're going to go from A to B to C to D. This is how we're doing it. And when we're done, because we're building these requirements, we know from the start, this is what we want to build when we're done. We know that when we get to this thing, that is completion. Agile says, I don't really know exactly what I'm going to build. So it's much more open-ended. And it could be done. You could literally do Agile forever. You could have a project that never ends because you're just going to go from sprint to sprint to sprint. And also theoretically, you could end it at any time because you're going from sprint to sprint to sprint. And theoretically, if you do it right, you have a working project at the end of each sprint. So at any given moment, any given sprint, I guess, you could say, okay, we're done. We're not going to do any more. And you should have something that's workable and go from there. Now, in the real world, that's not exactly how it works out, but to some extent, that is how it works out. Agile with that grows by sprints. Each sprint allows you to, as I talked about it earlier, is you have this deliverable. Theoretically, you've got this application you put out at the end of each sprint. And that means from sprint to sprint, the application grows. It becomes more feature rich. It has a deeper set of validations and things like that. In the waterfall approach, that's not how it works. Since it's an all or nothing, the only way you grow in the waterfall approach is there's a new version. You do the cycle again. So you go all the way through, boom, that's version 1.0. Start back at requirements gathering for version 1.1, go all the way through the cycle, boom, 1.1 is out. Then I do it again for 1.2, for 1.3, for 2.0, 3.0, 5.0, whatever it is. But waterfall, that's how I see the evolution of my application, is through versions. Agile, I'm going to see an evolution of my application by sprint. Agile, again, it adjusts to changes. If requirements change along the way, Agile is going to just take that in stride and say, yep, we knew that was going to happen, so it makes its adjustments and moves on. Waterfall does not do that. Waterfall, by its approach, says, we have our requirements. These are requirements. They're not going to change. This is what it is. Design, move forward, get done. Agile has regular checkpoints, which are these sprints. Along the way, we're going to put something out. We're going to be able to put it in front of people. We're going to be able to get feedback. Waterfall, because you don't do anything in a sense. I mean, you do stuff, but you don't deliver something until the end of a step. And sometimes you can go a very long period of time without defined progress. This, particularly back, if you're looking like the 70s and 80s, there were some software projects that were really, it was really a challenge for them to get out the door, because they were 18, 24-month-long projects. And there really wasn't anything within that process that allowed you to look into it. So you get 1 month out, and they would, of that, let's say it's a 24-month schedule they have to get the implementation done. They're into the 23rd month. They're like, okay, so we're about done, right? And people look around and say, I don't know. It may be, and there were some cases where that would have been the first time that anybody even said, oh, well, we're probably pretty close. Let's try to build everything. And of course, nothing works because nobody's ever tried to actually build the full application until that point. That may seem crazy, but there are examples of that kind of stuff happening. The adjusting to change, as I mentioned, it means that really part of that is because Agile assumes things change. Agile just comes in and says, okay, you got a requirement change. You want to move that there, or you want to change how that works a little bit, fine. We'll take it into account, put it in the next sprint, we'll be fine. In the waterfall approach, you're going to get pushback on changes, because a change is much more costly in a waterfall world. Everything has been planned, everything has been set up, and when you change, that means now we've got to find a way to adjust it. So you're probably more likely to have situations in a waterfall approach that says, okay, do you really, really, really need that change, or can you live without it? And there's definitely value in that. There are times when software should have gotten shipped years before and didn't, because there was just all these little tweaks and adjustments, and we'll do this and we'll add that, and it never actually got out the door fully because it was just spending too much time trying to get it exactly right. Waterfall says, okay, this is what exactly right is. We're going to go there, we're going to get done, and we're going to ship it. Thinking back to that car example, if I'm going from the East Coast to the West Coast, it could take a long time to get there if I'm just sort of meandering around and I get off track a little bit, and I'm like, oh yeah, while I'm off track here, I'm going to go check this thing out, and then I'm going to go over here and check that thing out. On the opposite side of it, if you go the waterfall approach of, this is my starting point, that's my ending point, I've figured out every road I'm going to take and every stop I'm going to make and every gas station I'm going to go to and how long, I can know exactly, or really close to exactly, how long it takes me to get from point A to point B, or from my start to my destination. Agile, I have no idea. And it probably is going to take quite a bit longer to get there. And actually, if you do it that way, you may never get to your original destination. You may decide that, nope, I'm going somewhere completely different. Agile says, oh, okay, we're okay with that. That's fine with us. That works. That's because we're going to get where we wanted to get to. Maybe we want to get to now. Maybe 6 months ago when we planned this out, we wanted to get to location A, but as we learned along the way, we realized no, we really wanted to get to location B, and so Agile would get us there. We're okay with that. Waterfall says no, we know we want to get to location A. Let's get there as fast as possible and efficiently as possible. I want to walk through, and this is a contrived little example. I'm trying to keep this simple enough. I want to walk through the idea of sort of give us a little bit of experience of a waterfall approach to a project and an agile approach. And I'm not going to get into each of the steps and the details of it, but I want to walk through it enough to start getting some ideas in your head about what kinds of things can come up and how the different approaches are going to handle them. So I'm going to keep it simple. We'll start out with a very simple set of requirements of it. This isn't going to be an application for, we'll say it's a web application for tracking grades. So it allows a student to enter a number grade, the class that, it's a class that they took, and then a grade that they got. And there's going to be some sort of reporting on it. So we'll just sort of start with that. It's a very simple definition to our project. So starting from let's look at the waterfall approach. So as we're gathering requirements, because that's the first thing we do with the waterfall approach to our application. Okay, we're gathering requirements and we realize, all right, there's going to be a single user. A user can have multiple classes. They can go to English, they can go to math, they can have a science class, stuff like that. Grades are going to be on a scale from 0 to 100. One of the things in that reporting that we want to do is we're going to provide an overall average grade for a class. And with that report, we want to be able to see the average for the class, but also the grades that we got, because we can have multiple grades per class. We've got quizzes and tests and stuff like that. And so we put this together, and then we put this into a system requirements document. And there's different names for them officially, but I've heard them early on. It's an SRD, a system requirements document, or software requirements document. And the name is not really as important, but the important critical part is that, okay, we got through gathering requirements. We have a requirements document that lists them out and gives us the details for them. Now we move to design. So in the design, we sit down and we say, this is what we've got as our requirements. So we're going to create a general look and feel for the application. We're going to create a page and design a page that's where a user would enter the class name and maybe some information about the class and the grade entry form. So I'm going to be able to enter a grade for a test or homework or whatever I did. We're going to design a template that says this is roughly what the report looks like. Obviously the data will be specific. We're going to have to design somewhere where we're going to store this data, how we're going to store this data. We're going to design all the middleware, business rules, validations. These are all the things that we need to think about as where, that we need to code to make sure that all of these other pieces work properly. And then, all of this rolls into a detailed design document. And you may have a high-level design document and then a detailed design document, things like that. There are different ways, different artifacts that may come out of this, but generally speaking, we're just going to focus now that, hey, so we've done all this and we have a document that says this is how this thing is designed. And then we get to move into implementation. So the implementation is going to go in and they start coding out those designed items. They've got them all listed out. So it's like, all right, boom, we're going to walk our way through. We're going to check them off as we get them done. We're going to code it. We're going to put a unit test together. Note that, testing does go on during the implementation. It's not the QA team. This is the developers, but they're going to go in and at least create some unit tests around each chunk of code or functionality that they're building. Along the way, they're probably going to be doing some sort of combination of units into a system. And they're, while not necessarily in a formal fashion, they're still going to be doing some sort of integration testing and building based on that. And then they get to the point where they're going to ready to deliver an application to testing. Well, this is where things start going a little off. All right, so there's a couple oops. So we get to the end of implementation, and then somebody says, "Oh, we've now realized that we have to support letter grades, not just the numbers. We got to be able to say that this is an A, a B, a C, a D, and F." And also, oh yeah, we need to have a secure login. It's not just a single user system that they just jump in. We want to make sure that they have some sort of a login. So now at this point, you've got these additional requirements. And while they may have popped up somewhere along implementation, this is really the first point where we can take a look at doing something with those. And so, you're stuck with this as if you're a product owner or a project owner, you have to look at it and say, okay, yeah, we really, we've been asked to support letter grades. Do we really need to do that? Or is that something that we say, nope, we're going to push that off and we're going to pick that up in the next version? Probably that one we're going to say, all right, we're going to pick that up in the next version. Needing a secure login. Ooh, what do we do with that? Now maybe this isn't usable without a secure login, in which case, then maybe we have to go back and essentially start all over again. We have to add, update the requirements, update the design, go back and, essentially update the implementation. That sounds like really costly. Now it's a small application, so maybe we do that. If it was a larger application, maybe we say, nope, sorry, that becomes version 1.1 or a quote hot fix. But most likely in that case, it would be, that's going to be version 1.1. So there's already a couple of features that we're not going to have in this thing when we're done. But we're okay with that because we said, hey, those were not part of what we wanted to think about when we first built this. So now we move on to testing. So the QA team goes in, they do a full system test. They're going to find some bugs because bugs do exist, and they get reported back and they get fixed. Well, maybe along this line, we get this, and then we get this other oops, is that as they're testing it, they realize that, well, what we really need to do, we don't just need, a single user that can log in. We actually really do need to be able to support multiple users within our data store. Because maybe we had all this information, but maybe we didn't properly have it set up. So now, oh crap, we've got to add support for another user. And there may be a very it's sort of a downside in this that I haven't really touched on yet, is it could be a very time-consuming bug fix cycle, because when you look back at the implementation, they were doing these unit tests and maybe a little bit of integration testing, but this is really the first time that all of this has been brought together and that we've tried to actually make all of this code work. And this could be a substantial amount of code that we're suddenly bringing together. And because of that, that means that we're not really sure. We don't have a checkpoint along the way to say that, oh, the code worked up to this point. We could have code that we wrote on day one that was wrong, that we're just now finding the problem or finding out that it's got a bug. And since you don't really know where to look to, find the source of bugs, it's time consuming. It means you really are going to have to walk through at a detailed level to try to figure out where it actually is breaking. Whereas if we had an application that mostly worked, or that we knew it mostly worked, or that we, better yet, knew that it did work 100% at a certain point, and then we made some changes and it broke, well, we'd be able to focus on where those changes were made, as opposed to having to look at essentially the whole code base to figure out where the bugs occur. So it's probably going to be a pretty time-consuming bug fix cycle. But all of that being said, we get into it and we, hunker down and we get it done. And so at some point, we get to a point where QA passes the application and they said, okay, we've got, whatever's left of known bugs are not critical enough. We're going to let it go with this, and they move it on to the next step. And so you go into deployment. So the deployment team goes in and they're going to deploy the application. This is another opportunity for a rather big oops, is let's say that there was a new operating system version that was released somewhere since we started the requirements. Well, it may be that the way we configure the application, it's not supported on this new operating system version. We targeted version 1 with our requirements. Well, now version 2's out there of the operating system. Well, too late. So at this point, it's like, okay, well, we're going to ship this thing out, and it's only going to be supported on that older operating system version. We've got this new application we put out, and everybody that has the latest version of the operating system can't use it. We're going to deal with that in version 1.1. So we go into the maintenance phase now. We deployed it. So now we move into the maintenance phase. And basically what happens in this point is we're going to go back through those oopses that we saw along the way. And those are essentially going to be the core of our requirements for the next version. So we're going to start with those. We're going to see if there's any other requirements that have come up along the way, or roadmap item requirements that we said, okay, well, this, we said we're going to get to version 1. And then version 1.1, here's what it was going to do. So we're going to build all those requirements in. And then we basically repeat the process. So now we go back, we're in that requirements phase. We're going to put those together. Then we're going to move those to design into implementation, and so on and so forth. So now let's take the same thing and let's think about it in an Agile approach. Now from Agile, as soon as we start, we go into sprint 1. So let's say the way we looked at sprint 1, because we have nothing, we're going to get some basics. So we're going to put something together that has a very rough look and feel. Maybe it's going to have a very, almost like a clickable demo page, a very basic design for a page to add a class, design for the grade entry form, and then we're doing some testing of those features. That's sprint 1. So at the end of this sprint, we have this thing that is it's a rough stab at how this is going to look in the end, and probably has very little functionality, but you can look at a couple of pages, and the code that we've got so far, we've spent a little time testing it and putting it together. Sprint 2, we go in and let's say that focuses on data. So now that we've, because we have this rough couple of pages, so we're going to go in and, knowing what we know, we're going to build out the data stores, however that is, create the database or file structures. Maybe we're going to spend some time, we've got a little bit of time, we're going to put some code in to actually allow users to enter data and save it into that store. Maybe along the way, let's say we've got enough time that we're going to actually put a little bit of averaging, the ability to average those grades. We're going to be able to build that functionality in. And maybe there's not much of a report to it, but maybe that stores data off in another data store area, another table. So that would allow us to test these changes that we made in this sprint. And we can even do it using that user interface, because this is building on it. We're using that user interface we built in the prior sprint. So along the way, we're not only testing these things that we see, we also know that we can, like at this point, enter a class and save it and know that the data got saved to the store. We can enter a grade on a class and know that the data got saved to the store. And we can enter multiple grades, and we can see that, oh yeah, we were able to average those properly. So sprint 3, now let's look at some new features, some additional stuff that we're starting to flesh out this little thing that we've put together. Now, along the way, we found out that, we need to have a way for users to log in. Well, we say, all right, well, we'll look at that. We can add a login page. And so we're going to put that into this sprint. And with that, we're going to give a registration page so that we can have a user actually create, their record. And we also, though, have to sort of flip back, because now what we built in those prior screens there's going to be some changes. So we're going to have a little bit of different data that's in our data store. We're probably going to have a little bit different navigation, because we have to have the ability to log in and log out, and maybe a link to a registration page. So we get that stuff done, and we test the new features, and we validate the data. And really, in this case, this is almost like a sideline sprint to some extent, because these are things that we weren't going to do before. But we said, oh, there's some new features. So we just took a sprint and said, we're going to incorporate those new features. We validate the data and test it. And now we have, at the end of this sprint, all of the things that we had, but now we've also incorporated that new requirement to have a user login. So now we can go back and sprint 4. Now we're going to go back to sort of focusing as we were originally. So we're going to create the report templates. We figured that, we've got some data, so let's start looking at that. We're going to start building out some of those validations and really flesh out those screens for the data entry. And let's say this is where suddenly we found out that, we've got to adjust for letter grades. Okay, we've got to be able to handle letter grades. Well, we're going to tackle that within this one. And so we're going to say, okay, well, how do we do that? What does that look like? We probably did some of the requirements gathering and design in a prior sprint. Or it could be something that, hey, they just have it in here, so we're going to start on it this time, but maybe we're not going to complete it until a sprint or two down the road. But at any rate, now we've added more features. We're going to test it using the user interface, using all those pieces we've done to this point. And maybe at this point, this is also where, let's say this is where the operating system upgrade was done. Well, we can test it in the new operating system and see if there's any issues that come up running this in that new operating system. If there are, then we can build those into the backlog, and we'll address those in future sprints. So now, let's say that there's minimal changes we need to make for the operating system, so we're continuing to move forward, and now we've got somewhat of fairly fully featured application, so we're going to focus on the reports. So we're going to take those known reports, and we're going to crank those things out. Well, let's say we need to spend a little bit of time because we realize that we have to have multiple users supported. And so we're going to make that change to the data store, the navigation, because now it's maybe like log in or log in as another user or something like that. And then we're able to test this whole system together using the test data that we've built up over the last few sprints. Again, we're done with this, and we've got something that's, at this point, assuming that the tests come out okay, we've got something that supports user login, multiple users, works on the latest version of the operating system, and it may not be the most beautiful thing in the world, but we're probably getting pretty close to a really good product. So that gives us, steps us into sprint 6. So at this point, what we're doing is saying, okay, well, are there some things that, like bugs that have come up, or maybe some changes that we haven't quite hit, along the way? It's sort of like I said, it's like a little bit of a catch up and let's make sure we're ready to sort of wrap this thing up for an actual, like maybe full release to our customers. So we're going to make sure we get our backlog addressed, and then we're going to do at this point, one of the things we do is we actually do a production deploy to whatever our final server is. Maybe we were able to test that out and do actual system testing, as part of the QA part of this particular sprint. Maybe now, before we've been deploying out to maybe a development and a stage server. Well, maybe we're at the point we say, well, let's actually try to deploy this to the production server and make sure that all works and that we've caught all the things we need to. And so that moves us into the next sprint. So now, if there's any fixes that we need to do, we're going to address those. We're basically, we've gotten all the way to the end. We've said we have a product that we could put out to the production server. Maybe there's a couple bugs. So in sprint 7, we're going to say, all right, let's go ahead and address those bugs so that we can deploy an update to the production server at the end of this sprint. But then along the way, maybe there's some new features here that we want to start working on. We've basically got our version 1 out to our customers, and we're basically starting all over again and saying, all right, well, now we can start putting in new features and enhancements that we wanted to do for version 1.1. We're going to start work on those things. We're going to, see what we've got, and maybe it's, maybe some additional validations or a new screen. We'll start work on those things. And so that gets us, through to essentially version 1.1. Now, notice that, I guess before I get into that, notice that the sprints, I didn't say whether they were a day long, a week long, a month long. And theoretically, and actually in practice, any of those sprints, there's things that need to be worked on. And based on the amount of time you have in that sprint, you either, put stuff into the sprint that is going to be done in it, or you pull it back out. That's part of the grooming, is you have an estimation of how long it's going to take you to get these tasks done. You've got a certain amount of hours in a day and hours in a sprint. And so you can, pull items in roughly. You're going to schedule things in a sprint saying, okay, this is what we want to tackle. And we think this is what can be done in that period of time. And then, the team, as they get time to work on stuff, they'll start pulling stuff off the board. And if there's something that's left over, it may be that will just move into the next sprint, or maybe it gets back on the backlog and comes in, a sprint or two down. Generally, you just say, okay, we're going to do our best to get as much done as we can and get ourselves to a stopping point at each sprint, at least not necessarily a stopping point, but a delivery point, and then we move on to the next sprint. So sort of taking this, we've gone through quite a bit, but just a couple of sort of thoughts to try to set into your mind as we wrap this one up is Agile in general is going to be better for larger dynamic kind of projects where you've got a longer distance from your start to your finish. Waterfall is going to be better for stable and small projects. While going that example that I said where you go from the East Coast to the West Coast, Agile is probably going to be better in a sense because you're going to be able to adjust for things like, maybe the weather's bad and you have to change directions, or maybe, food's out at a certain restaurant, or I don't know, there's just different things that can happen. It's because it's a longer trip, there's more opportunity for things to happen. If you're just going cross town, it's a small trip. The opportunity for things to happen are not as much. It's not as likely that you're going to hit an accident, or, storm's going to suddenly come up or something like that. So Waterfall is going to be better for stable and smaller projects. Stable being those where the requirements and they're not as likely to change. And think about that operating system upgrade that I mentioned in the example. If you've got a Waterfall project that takes 18 months, it's more likely that stuff like that's going to happen. If it takes a month, you're not as likely to have an unforeseen software update that's going to have to be taken into account. At the end of the day, though, either methodology could work for any project. It's just the challenges and the applicability is going to vary depending on the project and the methodology. I think it's important to note that the core tasks of gathering requirements and design and implementation and testing and deploying, those exist no matter what the methodology is. At the end of the day, these are still SDLC, software development lifecycle methodologies. They hit on those core things that you have to do for every piece of software. At this point, I'm going to open it up for questions and comments.
So why is it so hard? Like, for instance, I don't know, Agile all of a sudden became dominant in the IT world. I don't know why most companies are beginning adopting it, but why is it so hard to implement in companies?
I think it's there's a couple different reasons. One is that there is often a thought that Agile allows you to skip maybe or skimp on some of those core tasks. So the Agile approach, and I've even heard some people say that, oh yeah, you don't need to design, you don't spend any time in design in the Agile approach, you just get in and you start coding. That's wrong. If you start just randomly, if you just start coding and you haven't spent some sort of time design, you're going to end up, in trouble. There's going to be issues with that. And so that's part of it. Some of it is newer, and it was, I think partially Agile was assumed to be simpler than it is for a long period of time. So even though now we're probably, 25, 30 years into people trying to do Agile in varying ways. But I think for a long time it was done wrong. And so people learned from people that didn't know how to do it properly. And really just in the last, 5, probably more like 10 years or so, I think, companies and organizations are starting to realize that, wait, this isn't like some, slipshod casual approach. There's still a lot of important things that need to be done. And there are definitely good and bad ways to do Agile. And so I think it is starting to get better, but it just has had a sort of a long time in adopting it, because I think people thought it was a faster, cooler way to get software done. And rather than actually focus on doing it right, they just said, oh, well, we're doing it. And that's not the same. Just saying you do something and actually doing it are two different things. And I think that's where Agile has been a challenge. And like I said, it really is. I think it's more complicated to do an Agile project because everybody has to be a little more aware of all of the phases of the software development cycle.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've noticed that, like, when you talked about the design, like, I mean, I always assumed, like, honestly, that they just begin coding, because probably I've just been in one shop whereby they had an architect for the whole Agile project, but most shops I've been in, like, pretty much you just hear coding. I guess the developers are the ones who are doing also the design.
Yeah, that is not uncommon. All right, any other questions or comments? All right, then. Let's see. All right, so what do we learn? In a nutshell, the Agile process is performed in small cycles. It's usually, typically it's going to be like 2, 3, 4 weeks for a sprint, maybe as small as a 1 week sprint. Roughly, some people do 10 days, 15 days, 20 days, or something like that. But generally speaking, you're talking small cycles. You're not going to have a 6-month sprint or anything like that. Waterfall, the key indicator of that is you're going to complete each phase before you move on to the next one, and each phase being requirements, design, implementation. Agile almost in a way does the equivalent of like very small waterfall cycles repeated over and over and over again. And you can do it. You could actually do it that way. Typically it's not, because there's a couple short circuiting things you do. But in general, waterfall is going to be, set your path and do it, and walk through each step and get it done properly. Agile says, well, I'm just going to start traveling. I'm going to start moving forward on this, and we'll adjust as we go. Going back to like the Agile manifesto and stuff like that, Agile focuses on delivering software on a final product. Waterfall's focus is going to be, by default, it may not say it, but it's focused on documents. And really the key to that is reproducibility, is that those documents, those artifacts that you produce each step along the way in a waterfall process, allow you to look back and say, this is how we got here. This is what we did. This is what was used to get us from point A to point B to point C. And that gets us to the end. So as always, thank you for your time and your patience and working through all of this stuff. As always, if you have any additional questions or comments or anything like that, you can shoot us an email at info@developerpreneur.com. You can hit the contact us page out on developerpreneur.com. Twitter at developerpreneur. We've got posts on a regular basis and more than happy to respond to anything there. We also still have a Facebook page, which is facebook.com/developerpreneur. And we're just going to keep on trying to make every developer, including ourselves, a little bit better. Have a good one.